There's a specific feeling you get around 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon. You're staring at a screen. Nothing on it is technically wrong, and some quiet, exhausted part of your brain is running the numbers on what would happen if you just stood up, walked out of the building, and never came back. Now flip it. You're a samurai. It's 1650. You haven't fought in a real battle in 11 years, because there hasn't been one. The wars are over, the country is at peace, and you spend your days standing guard over a storehouse that has never once been robbed. Your lord has never spoken your name directly. Your sword hasn't left its sheath except for cleaning. And somewhere in there, on some forgotten Tuesday 400 years ago, a man exactly like you did the exact same math you're doing right now. The difference is, for you, quitting means an awkward conversation and a 2-week notice. For him, quitting could mean losing his name, his family's future, and his entire legal existence as a human being. So did samurai ever actually want to quit being samurai? What happened when they tried is nothing like the mythology, and some of it is genuinely disturbing. Here's what you've absorbed from every movie, every video game, every Way of the Warrior listicle. The samurai was a man who never doubted. Total loyalty, total devotion, death before dishonor, and he meant it every single morning of his life. Here's the thing. That version of the samurai was written mostly after samurai stopped existing. The word most people associate with samurai discipline, bushido, wasn't standardized as a formal code until 1900 in a book called Bushido, The Soul of Japan, written for a Western audience by a man named Nitobe Inazo, largely to explain Japan to people who had never been there. Historian Oleg Benish, in his 2014 book Inventing the Way of the Samurai, has traced how much of the Way of the Warrior as we now picture it was assembled well after the fact, retrofitted onto a class of people who lived far messier, far more ambivalent lives than the legend allows. And the piece itself is part of the problem. For roughly 250 years of the Edo period, Japan had almost no wars at all, which means the warrior class spent most of its actual existence not fighting, just waiting, administering, and for a lot of them, quietly wondering what any of it was for. And it wasn't just historians retrofitting the legend after the fact. Samurai themselves, writing at the time, complained constantly about exactly this. Domain diaries and personal letters from the period are full of grumbling about pointless duty rosters, tedious ceremonial obligations, and superiors nobody respected. 400 years before quiet quitting had a name, samurai were doing a version of it, showing up, performing the minimum required bow, and going home to write bitterly about it in their diaries. Somewhere, a bureaucrat samurai in 1680 was complaining about his supervisor exactly the way you complained about yours last Tuesday. So if the iron devotion was mostly a later invention, assembled on top of 2.5 centuries of peacetime boredom, what were real samurai actually feeling? Turns out, a lot of them were miserable, and more of them wanted out than the legend has any room for. To understand why quitting was such a nightmare, you have to understand what being a samurai actually was. And it wasn't a job title. It was a legal identity, stapled to your family, for life, whether you wanted it or not. Historian Konstantin Vaporis, in his 2008 book Tour of Duty, spent years reconstructing everyday samurai life from domain records, travel diaries, and household ledgers, and the picture that emerges is startlingly unglamorous. A class that was less warrior and more hereditary government employee. By the 1600s, most samurai weren't fighting anything. They were guards, clerks, tax auditors, and paperwork custodians, paid in rice, a fixed stipend called a koku, that didn't go up no matter how well you performed, and didn't go down no matter how badly you didn't. Imagine a job where your salary was set the day you were born and stayed exactly the same for the rest of your life. No raises, no bonuses, no performance reviews, just rice, forever. Here's the surprising part. You couldn't promote your way out of a bad situation, and you couldn't quietly transfer to a different lord either. Your loyalty wasn't a preference. It was registered, like a legal document. A samurai's status was tied to one specific domain, under one specific lord, and switching allegiance without permission wasn't a career move. It was treated as a form of betrayal serious enough to get your entire family stripped of rank, sometimes generations after you were gone. It's the strangest kind of trap. An elite, respected position that you were born into, that you could not meaningfully improve, and that you were absolutely not supposed to want to leave. Historian Aiko Ikegami, in her 1995 study, The Taming of the Samurai, argues that this rigid, unchangeable identity is exactly why honor became so psychologically loaded for this class specifically. When you cannot change your circumstances, your reputation becomes the one asset you actually control. It's the only stock you're allowed to trade. And this went all the way down to your rank within the household, not just your household itself. A younger son of a mid-ranking samurai family could spend his entire life watching an older brother inherit everything: the stipend, the title, the position, while he himself was left with a name, a sword, and functionally nothing to do with either. There was no equivalent of switching companies. There wasn't really an equivalent of switching careers. There was the rank you were handed at birth, and 4 or 5 socially acceptable ways to survive not liking it. Which raises the real question underneath all of this. If a samurai genuinely couldn't take the pressure anymore, what were his actual options? Before we go any further, I want to know what you think. If you'd been born into a job you were legally forbidden to leave, with your entire family's status riding on you gritting your teeth and showing up, do you think you'd have stayed and endured it, or found a way out, whatever the cost? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. There was, technically, a way out. It just wasn't resignation. It was becoming a ronin. Most people hear ronin and picture a wandering warrior with a tragic backstory. Sword for hire, cinematic, cool. The actual word is far more revealing. Ronin is written with the characters for wave and person. Longren, a person adrift, pushed by currents they don't control, belonging nowhere. Nobody chose that title for the romance of it. It was closer to a bureaucratic classification for formerly employed, and it carried real social weight. A ronin had no stipend, no guaranteed status, and in most cases, no way back in. Historian Carl Friday, whose research on Japan's early warrior class stretches back to his 1992 book, Hired Swords, has documented just how precarious this status actually was. A ronin wasn't a free agent with options. He was closer to someone whose entire professional license had just been revoked, with no appeals process. And here's the detail that never makes it into the movies. The overwhelming majority of ronin didn't choose it. Their lord's domain was abolished, or their lord died without an heir, or their lord committed some offense that cost the whole household its lands, and every samurai serving under him became a ronin overnight, through no decision of his own. You could lose your entire identity because of a mistake somebody else made in a castle you'd never visited. Voluntarily walking away from your post to become one was rare, difficult, and treated less like liberation and more like social death. Imagine resigning from your job and discovering the reference check makes you unemployable everywhere forever. Some ronin did eventually find new positions. A handful of domains would take on skilled outsiders, especially in specialized roles like accounting or martial instruction. But the wait could be years. The pay was almost always worse, and the stigma rarely fully lifted. A ronin who'd once served a respected house carried that unemployment like a visible mark, the kind other samurai families would quietly factor into whether they'd let their daughter marry into his. Which tells you something the legend never admits. For most samurai, wanting to quit and being able to quit were two completely separate categories of problem. So if walking away wasn't really an option, what did an exhausted samurai actually do? He became a monk. Shukke, literally leaving the household, was a formally recognized act of religious renunciation, and it was one of the only socially acceptable exits from samurai obligation that didn't require your lord's death or your family's ruin. A samurai who took Buddhist vows wasn't deserting. He was transferring his entire identity into a different, protected category the feudal system had already made room for, on purpose, centuries earlier. It sounds almost too convenient, and it was used that way constantly. Aging lords retired into monkhood the moment a succession dispute got politically inconvenient. Warriors who'd simply had enough of court life shaved their heads, took a new religious name, and quietly vanished from the register of active obligation. It was, in a very real sense, feudal Japan's version of an exit clause, buried in the fine print of an entire society's religious structure. The pre-modern equivalent of discovering your company's HR policy has a clause nobody mentions in the handbook. For samurai who didn't want the finality of full renunciation, there was a quieter, more socially invisible move. Retreat into the arts. Picture a samurai in his 40s, sitting seiza on a tatami floor, hands wrapped around a tea bowl instead of a sword hilt, utterly absorbed in getting the whisking motion exactly right. Tea ceremony, garden design, calligraphy, poetry, the aristocratic hobbies of peacetime samurai weren't just cultivated refinement. They were a legitimate, honor-preserving way to disappear from active duty without technically leaving it. A samurai who threw himself into becoming an obsessive tea master was still, on paper, a samurai. In practice, he'd built himself a version of the job that involved almost none of the parts that were crushing him. But here's where it gets darker. Because not every unhappy samurai found a graceful exit, and the ones who didn't sometimes ran out of options entirely. Domain administrative records from the Edo period, the kind Vaporis and other historians have spent careers combing through, document a recurring, quietly devastating pattern. Low-ranking samurai denied both promotion and any honorable route out, simply abandoning their post and their name. The act had its own term, dakko-ronin, self-made ronin, and it was treated not as a personal choice, but as a crime against the domain. If caught, the consequences fell not just on the man, but on the family he'd left registered behind him. And for some, the calculation was even bleaker. Rather than live with the disgrace of failure or flight, they chose the one exit the system had always sanctioned as honorable, seppuku. Not as battlefield glory, but as a quiet, administrative way to close a file that had become unbearable to keep open. That's the detail the mythology never shows you. For a system built entirely around never showing weakness, an extraordinary number of the exits it left available were designed for people who had already given up. So, did samurai actually want to quit being samurai? Constantly. The honest answer is that most of them weren't the unshakable warrior monks of the movies at all. They were bureaucrats with swords, born into a job with no severance package and no resignation letter. And the pressure of that, the specific, grinding pressure of being trapped in an identity you can't change and can't escape, pushed some of them into monasteries, some of them into tea houses, and a few of them into something much darker. Here's the modern mirror, and it's closer than you'd think. The next time you feel completely locked into a job, a reputation, or a version of yourself that everyone around you expects you to keep performing, no matter how much of you it's quietly using up, you are feeling something a samurai in 1650 would have recognized instantly. The specific exhaustion of being trapped by who you're supposed to be, rather than by what you're actually doing, isn't a modern invention of corporate life. It's one of the oldest kinds of tired there is. The stipend changes. The tatami becomes an office chair. The feeling underneath it is the same feeling, running on the same nervous system, 400 years apart. And there's a strange gift hiding in that word ronin. English actually borrowed it. You'll hear corporate ronin used today for someone who's walked away from an institution to work for themselves, unaffiliated, ungoverned by anyone's stipend. We took a word that once meant person adrift, belonging nowhere, a classification nobody wanted, and quietly turned it into a compliment. If you've ever left a job that defined you and felt lost before you felt free, that specific in-between feeling has had a name in Japan for 800 years. You're not making it up. Somebody wrote it down centuries before you felt it. So next time it's 2:47 on a Tuesday and you're doing the quiet math on walking out, remember the man standing guard over a storehouse that's never once been robbed 400 years ago, running the exact same numbers in the exact same silence. He didn't get a 2-week notice. He got a monastery, a tea house, or a blade. And somehow, inside all of that, he still found a way to choose something. And if you think choosing your own exit was hard, wait until you find out what happened when the choice wasn't yours at all. When one small, quiet decision by someone else in your household could bring the entire group down with them. That story is next. You're doing what humans have always done. You're looking for the door.